All right, you guys should be able to see that now. Okay, cool. Um, I'll leave answering questions. We'll have a Q&A after, so it'll be about 25 to 30 minutes for the presentation, and then maybe like 10 minutes or so for Q&A afterwards if you guys have anything you want to discuss or roundtable talk about. So leave any questions you want in the chat and can respond to them afterwards. All right, let me just full screen that. All right, has it gone full screen from your guys' perspective?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. All right, let's begin. All right, welcome everyone to the Taiwan Conundrum, an overview of its history and future. So, this presentation will be all about Taiwan. So the first question we'll be asking is, why are we even talking about Taiwan? So the rationale lies at the intersection of explicit reasons and implicit reasons, shown by this diagram here. The explicit reasons are, so its position in the Asia Pacific and recent concerns about Chinese invasion hold massive implications for pretty much anything you might be interested in: geopolitics, economics, your portfolio, and just generally the world order as we know it. Despite this, its history and background is barely known by most people, probably because the news is like 95% when it talks about Taiwan, just talks about, oh, China's going to invade, but doesn't actually give any like background or implications behind that. So I want to kind of rectify that with this presentation here. A better understanding of how we got here will better prepare us for what lies ahead. So those are the explicit reasons. Those are the nice ones. The implicit reason is I read some books about it recently, and basically I just want to nerd out, which is a recurring feature in my life. So now that all that's out of the way, let's start off by talking a bit about the geography of Taiwan and its like relative position, just so we have a bit of a basis behind our discussions that will come a bit later. Okay. So from a geographic position, Taiwan is located off the coast of China, very nicely centered in kind of like this Asia Pacific region here. It's about 10 hours away from Sydney by flying, 7,000 kilometers, 3,000 kilometers from Singapore, 2,000 kilometers from Tokyo, and only about 350 kilometers from the Chinese coast. That is very important, and that will come up in the conversation down the line. So very nicely located. In terms of what it looks like a bit like a human liver. Don't ask me how I know what a human liver looks like. It's 6,000 kilometers squared. So it's actually quite small. It's the 135th country by total size, a bit bigger than Belgium, but a little smaller than Switzerland. To help you guys kind of understand just how big or small that is, depending on how you see it, this is me overlaying Taiwan over New South Wales. So it extends from Sydney to the north, Bega to the south, and Canberra to the west. So yeah, not actually a particularly big country when you look at it like that. And it's just a smidge over double the size of Tasmania. That said, it has a population of 23 million versus Australia's 27 million. And the population density is 185 times different, but that's going to be true for any country compared to Australia because we're basically one giant desert, but worth knowing. So this map here shows the population in Taiwan and how it's distributed. So red is obviously the more densely populated areas. Can any of you guess why the population is so clustered along this west side here? So just give it like 5 seconds, maybe type it down in the chat. You can take a guess why. All right. So the reason is that Taiwan is extremely mountainous. Its tallest peak is 4,000 meters high, and it has 164 mountains over 3,000 meters. So it's a great country for hiking. And yeah, you can see the population is almost exclusively clustered in the areas that don't have a giant mountain on it. Climate-wise, Taiwan is hot in the north and very hot in the south. Can you guess why? I won't give you time for that. It's because the Tropic of Cancer literally slices it more or less in two. So it is a very, very hot country. Okay, so that's a bit of geographic overview. Now we can get to the meat of it, which is a brief history of Taiwan. So history, like a lot of things, can get quite dense. So I'll try and intersperse with like fun facts and cute little things on the side to make it a bit more interesting. All right, let's begin. 4,500 BC to 1500 AD. Taiwan was occupied by Formosans, that is to say indigenous Taiwanese, for thousands of years before it was colonized by foreigners. The land was split into many tribes and subtribes with a variety of different languages and cultures. So if you've ever seen a language map of Australia prior to colonization, it's actually pretty similar. Lots of different like tribes, related, unrelated, kind of living together in not exactly peaceful coexistence, since they did a lot of headhunting. They were primarily hunter-gatherers, farmers and fishers. Metalwork, animal husbandry, and trade was widespread. About 3% of Taiwan's modern population, which is equivalent to 600,000 people, claim heritage to these people. All right, then, it's time for our very first Fun Facts Corner, Tolly's Fun Facts Corner. And you can tell it's fun because it has a Z instead of an S. All right, so there are 400 million ethnically Austronesian people on Earth, and they're kind of spread throughout this population band here. The current anthropological consensus for their origin is called the out-of-Taiwan model, which posits that all Austronesians are descended from people who sailed from Taiwan thousands of years ago, and you can kind of see like a bit of a timeline in this map here. This means that indigenous Taiwanese are ethnically related to Indonesians, Filipinos, Maori, Malagasy, which are people from Madagascar, and Hawaiians. So it's actually quite a big and interesting kind of like brotherhood, I suppose you could kind of say. They're all related to one another. All right, awesome. 1500s onwards. In this period, Taiwan started to have more interactions with outsiders. Chinese and Japanese pirates hopped around the coast for smuggling purposes. I probably should have put like a picture of One Piece here, but you get the idea. The Spanish and Dutch set up forts for trade and naval control of the area. They began to import men from southern China for cheap labor. This is the beginning of the colonization or the proliferation of Han Chinese people inside of Taiwan. Interactions with indigenous people was complex, with many shifting political alliances, fighting, and intermarriage in this period. All right, it's time for another fun fact. The original name of Taiwan was Formosa, from the Portuguese Ilha Formosa, meaning beautiful island. If Laura is in the chat right now, I'm sure she's cringing, but this is the best Portuguese I can do right now. Formosa became the name of Taiwan among Europeans for centuries, and is still a name of pride for Taiwanese to this day. However, historian and killjoy Ong Lok Tek notes that Portuguese sailors had a habit of screaming Ilha Formosa at every island they spotted. So there are over a dozen Formosas in the world today. This preceding fact is irrelevant to all true Taiwanese patriots, of course. All right, cool. 1600s. In mainland China at the time, the Ming dynasty was being destroyed by the armies of the Manchu Qing dynasty. A part Chinese, part Japanese pirate called Koshinga supported the remaining Ming. With the mainland too dangerous, he fled to Taiwan, where he drove out the Europeans and successfully took over the island in the name of the remaining Ming dynasty. The island would be renamed Dongning and become a base to one day return and reconquer the Chinese mainland. That might sound familiar again with this guy down here, but we'll get to him. All right, during this period, the Dongning Kingdom would be a thorn in Qing dynasty China's side for decades. They would raid the coast repeatedly, which led to the Emperor of China declaring that no one was allowed to live within 50 kilometers of the entire coastline of South and Eastern China. So imagine if Albanese got a bit mad at New Zealand for some reason, and he said no one could live within 50 kilometers of the Australian coastline. Very similar kind of concept, and it just shows how much power the emperors had back then. Koshinga's descendants attempted a full invasion of the mainland, which was unsuccessful. Finally, a Chinese fleet was sent and conquered Taiwan in 1683, bringing the island under mainland Chinese control for the first time in its history. So when China says Taiwan belongs to us, this history extends back to 1683 from an ideological point of view. All right, then, kind of time for another fun fact. So China, by which I mean mainland China's first aircraft carrier was commissioned in 2012. Its initial name during tests was the Xilong, after the admiral that invaded Taiwan. Perhaps not being exactly subtle about its intentions or its purpose, it was renamed to the Liaoning afterwards. So very clear what they want to use that for. So from the 1600s to the 1800s, Taiwan was technically a part of China. However, the Chinese government never really wanted Taiwan in the first place. It became a dumping ground for many corrupt or worthless officials, and most of the island was left under indigenous control, kind of similar to the Northern Territory. Take that back, that was a joke. So you can see from this map here that the majority of the island is actually under Chinese control, and not under Chinese control, and the Chinese are just kind of spread across the west side here. It was also very dangerous. Case in point, a Japanese army went into the jungle to attack some indigenous people. 12 died from fighting, 550 died from malaria. So it is indeed a tropical jungle and not a very nice place to be without antibiotics. Early on, plans were made to abandon Taiwan or rent it out to the Dutch, but nothing actually really came of these ideas. It only became an official province of China in 1887 and would be given to the Japanese in 1895, 8 years later. So yeah, very spotty history when it comes to Chinese control. Time for another fun fact. One of the major export items in this period was the hide of the Formosan sika deer, this cute little fellow over here. A very large quantity of it was sold to Japan. Can you guess why? So I'll give you 5 seconds to maybe write in chat. What was it that the Japanese wanted a lot of during this period? All right, the answer is the hide was a vital component for samurai armor. If you ever see samurai armor in a museum that's 500 to 300 years old, there's actually a very decent chance it has Taiwanese deer hide within it. So nice little cultural export artifact there. All right, welcome now to the gallery of Qing quotes on Taiwan. So like I said before, China never really wanted Taiwan in the first place, and let's see how that's reflected in what the Chinese said about Taiwan. So, Taiwan is a ball of mud unworthy of development. It is full of naked and tattooed savages. It is a daily waste of imperial money with no benefit by the literal emperor of China. Nothing has changed. Just joking. Every 3 years an uprising, every 5 years a rebellion by Zhu Donggan, governor of Taiwan. And this was one of the chief diplomats during the War with Japan. When the Japanese stipulated that one of the chief terms for peace was for the cession of Formosa, I agreed. Had I been in another apartment all alone, I would have danced with joy in spite of my infirmities. So yeah, a lot of Chinese people or Chinese diplomats really did not care about Taiwan that much. And this is reflected in their policy and in their quotes. So, next time China says we really love Taiwan, we want you to be part of us again, just keep these in the back of your mind. All right, time for another fun fact. After Taiwan was surrendered to the Japanese, the ever-rebellious Taiwanese declared independence. The very short-lived Republic of Formosa was born. This led to a Japanese invasion, it's what they did in the period, and conquered the nation after a few months of fighting. Many people were killed, unsurprisingly, mostly from diseases. Remember, it's a bit of a malaria tropical zone. The main reason I want to bring this up is that Taiwan during this period had the greatest national flag in human history. This is a hill I'm prepared to die on. Look at its cute little tiger mouth. It's just amazing. This is what Japan took from us. Okay, cool. 1890s to 1940s. Taiwan was renamed Takasago and absorbed into the Japanese Empire. This is a postcard from that period, by the way. Violent pacification of the indigenous Formosans would occur in this period. Massive infrastructure projects were completed, including extensive railway networks, dams, and irrigation canals. So it was a very mixed legacy, like a lot of colonial endeavors. Actually, Taiwan is generally considered to be the second most industrialized nation in Asia at the time because of the Japanese investment. But as a counter to that, during World War II, local Taiwanese identity was suppressed and locals were forced to speak Japanese and take Japanese names. So again, very mixed legacy. Some of my Taiwanese friends actually say that their grandparents were fluent in Japanese because that's what they learned in elementary school. So fun fact there. It's been theorized that Taiwanese society's politeness and high level of trust compared to mainland China came from the Japanese influence. I can't say for certain whether that's the case, but it's what a lot of people do mention. So you can keep that in the back of your mind. All right, time for once again another fun fact. In World War II, indigenous Formosans would be recruited into the Imperial Japanese Army. They were called the Takasago Volunteer Corps and were considered expert jungle warriors, very useful in Southeast Asia. The last holdout of World War II was a guy called Atun Palalin, who was a Takasago soldier who continued fighting in the jungles of Indonesia until 1974, 29 years after the surrender of Japan. So yeah, some people just don't know when to quit, I suppose. The Takasago Corps spirits are enshrined with other Japanese soldiers, including a couple of war criminals, at the controversial Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. Attempts to return the spirits back to Taiwan have failed because apparently all the spirits are mixed up and we can't find the Taiwanese ones. That is the actual reason given by the head shrine guardian as to why the Taiwanese spirits can't come home. Because you wouldn't want to accidentally pluck out a Japanese one, would you? Okay, cool. 1940s to the 90s. Taiwan was handed back to mainland China after World War II ended. However, at the time, a civil war between the communists under this guy over here, Mr. Mao, and the ruling nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek over here ended in the communist victory. The nationalists fled mainland China for Taiwan in 1949. They took with them 2 million Chinese people, including most of its intellectual class, who did not want to be slaughtered by the communists, all its gold reserves, and much of its cultural treasures. So fun fact, if you want to see generally the most exquisite treasures of the emperors of China, you actually need to come to Taiwan, not to mainland China, because the Taiwanese took it all with them when they fled. So keep that in mind. All right, during this period, the nationalists, also known as the Kuomintang, would lead an oppressive one-party dictatorship over Taiwan for more than 50 years. Civil liberties were curtailed and thousands of political prisoners were executed or sent to re-education camps. So that's probably something that's worth keeping in mind. These days, we kind of hold authoritarian communist China against peaceful democratic Taiwan. But actually, for a lot of modern history, it's been authoritarian communist China versus authoritarian right-wing nationalist Taiwan. So, just worth keeping in mind. Extensive land reforms led to massive poverty reduction and economic growth. I don't actually have time to get into this, but it had one of the most successful land reforms in all of human history, and it's a very fascinating subject in and itself. So Taiwan became a factory of the world, producing all kinds of goods, resulting in 7% economic growth rate for several decades, making it one of the 4 Asian tigers. So you can see it was wedged here between South Korea and Hong Kong in terms of GDP per capita growth. So very impressive. Manufacturing of silicon chips began in the 1980s, and that would become one of Taiwan's most important industries to the modern era. All right, time for our last fun fact. So very sad to see them go. Most of the conversation about Taiwan these days is about a potential Chinese invasion. But in the 60s, it was actually the exact opposite. In the case of the disastrous Great Leap Forward and the Sino-Soviet split, the leader of Taiwan actually ordered an invasion of China to take it back from the communists. And this map here shows that it wasn't just China. They literally wanted to take all of Eurasia and also bomb Moscow. So very interesting alternative history there. It was called Project National Glory. Lack of US support led to them backing down before the invasion occurred. So once again, the US spoiled all the fun. So yeah, that's an interesting aside. From the 1990s to now, Taiwan's first democratic elections occurred in 1996. Same-sex marriage was legalized in 2019, making it the first in Asia. Currently, Taiwan exists in a state of unease, with the possibility of invasion from the mainland, and very few countries recognizing it as an independent nation. So things aren't too bad, but they're also not that great either. It's a very tenuous time to be Taiwan. All right, fantastic. Good stuff, everyone. We're through all the history. That should give you a pretty good overview of Taiwan's history up to the present day. And now we can start looking at a few kind of aspects of Taiwan in the modern landscape. So I want to give just a really quick amount of time just to kind of look at some facts about Taiwan from a high level. And I'll do it by comparing it to Australia to kind of give a bit of an idea of what the current kind of like economy and society is right now. So in terms of nominal GDP, Taiwan is 22nd in the world versus Australia's 13th. So not too far off each other. I guess it's double, but whatever. GDP per capita is 35,000 USD in Taiwan versus Australia's 68,000. So Taiwan is a first world country, fully developed nation, but there's no doubt about it, salaries and lifestyle is significantly higher in Australia. In terms of world happiness, Australia is 11th in the world versus Taiwan's 27th, which I believe makes it third in Asia after Israel and the UAE. So it's definitely a happier country than Japan. And having met Japanese people, Korean people, and Taiwanese, I can definitely say Taiwanese are the least miserable, but that's just my personal opinion. One area that Taiwan does kick Australia's butt in is economic complexity, which probably isn't too surprising considering in Australia, our economy is based around kicking the dirt and finding a lump of iron ore underneath it, whereas in Taiwan, they actually have to make stuff. So they're 5th in the world versus our 102nd in the world. And the house price per square meter, Taiwan is actually more expensive than Australia, 13,364 Australian dollars per square meter versus our 10,000. Whether that's good or not depends, I guess, whether you own property or not. So I'll leave that for you to decide. All right, now because we are an investment company, I want to just spend a bit of time talking about the 3 largest companies in Taiwan. I'm sure you've all heard about TSMC. It's the 9th largest company in the entire world by market cap, and they basically produce most of the world's semiconductors. I think like 2/3 come from these guys. They're a foundry, as well as most of the world's very high-tech semiconductors, 2 nanometers and less, is almost exclusively made by these guys. I think the only real competition in that space is Samsung, but they've actually been losing ground. So expect TSMC to be a very big player in that field for the years to come. And as you can see, they're quite a healthy company, at least based on our Snowflake. Next is MediaTek. They are primarily based around electronic goods, particularly integrated circuits. I've actually never heard of these guys before. I was shocked that these are the 2nd largest company in Taiwan, I believe by market cap or something. But yeah, needless to say, they are quite large, and they also look quite healthy according to our Snowflake. These third guys, this is probably the largest company or the most important company in the world that you've never heard of. They're called Honhai Precision Industries, and they make everything. They make iPhones, they make Kindle, they make pretty much all your gaming consoles, they make phones. If you have like a small electronic device that you do like little stuff with, like touch phones, it was probably made by these guys. Their revenue is 324 billion, so 1/3 of a trillion, and they only make $10 billion in profit off the back of that. So it just goes to show how tiny the margins are in the electronic manufacturing space. So these guys are less healthy. I haven't really dug into why, but you know, if any of these countries interest you, you can go in and check it out and make investments accordingly. All right, fantastic. So we've got the preamble out of the way. We've got the history. We know where we are. We know where we're going. Let's talk about what 99% of the news on Taiwan is, if you read in Western media, which is the possibility of a war with China. So you probably already have a pretty decent understanding based off the history section, but just to kind of draw a admittedly false equivalency, let me try and explain what the situation would be like if in Australia, which has resulted in the equivalent one in Taiwan. So imagine, for example, we have a leader who controls all of Australia. His name is ScoMo over here. He's a right-wing nationalist, and over here is our left-wing communist Albanese, so very similar to real life. Let's say that Albanese takes power away from ScoMo. In our case, that's due to democratic election, but in Taiwan, it was because of a war. So again, a bit of a false equivalency. But instead of power being completely given over to Albanese, the previous government basically flees and sets up a new capital in a different place in Australia and says, no, I'm still the controller of the country. He gets chased to Darwin, and then he flees to a small island off the coast of Australia, or, in the case of China, Taiwan. They fight, there's a war, and basically American ships out of nowhere and say, no, we're going to protect our precious friend ScoMo from the evil communist Albanese. And that has resulted in the People's Republic of Liburnia on the mainland and the Republic of Liberia on Tasmania. So bit of a false equivalency, but it's also kind of how things went down in China and Taiwan. It's resulted in a portion of what was traditionally part of the mainland territory, in our case Tasmania, now being under control of like a quote-unquote renegade government, who has basically gone their own way and doesn't want to be part of the mainland anymore. So that's kind of how it would have gone down in Australia. Whether you want to be in the Republic of Liburnia or the Republic of Liberia, I'll leave at your discretion. Okay, cool. So the situation from both perspectives, this is going to be a little dense, but I think it is important to kind of understand what both sides are arguing on the same issue. So Taiwan says it's never been under CCP, Chinese Communist Party control, and considers it a foreign dictatorship, which to be fair it is. Whereas China says Taiwan is a renegade province under an illegitimate government that's taken over part of China's territory. Taiwan has a history and culture sufficiently unique and distinct from China to justify being independent. Remember the thousands of years of indigenous Taiwanese people, very distinct from the Han Chinese. Whereas China says it's an integral part of China with a history and culture that is intrinsically linked to it. Also not incorrect. Again, it is primarily Han. This is an interesting survey that's been taken over the past 2.5 decades or so. It polls Taiwanese people about what they consider themselves to be. So green is Taiwanese, thatched is Chinese and Taiwanese, and red is exclusively Chinese. You can see that over time, the majority of Taiwanese people have come to either see themselves as exclusively Taiwanese or being a combination of the Chinese and Taiwanese identity. Almost no one considers themselves to be Chinese in that sense. So most Taiwanese people do not really want to be part of China, and you can look to Hong Kong to answer why. Taiwan offers no long-term risk to China. It just wants to get along by investment and trade, whereas China sees Taiwan as blocking its access to the Pacific and it might encourage other areas of the Sinosphere, such as Tibet, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong to rebel. So it wants to kind of make a case study of it. Taiwan is a wealthy and democratic nation with no interest in being under CCP yoke, whereas China thinks that the existence of a successful democratic nation within the Chinese orbit that isn't under CCP control kind of removes or is a counter to the idea that only the CCP can lead the Chinese people to greatness. So it's an ideological affront to their existence. Finally, Taiwan is fully self-sufficient and capable of defending its existence, whereas China wants Taiwan to be peacefully reunified, although military force is not off the table. So again, a bit dense, sorry for that, but I think it is important to see how both sides kind of see the same issues, but from different lenses. Okay, so why is invasion such an issue now? Probably every couple of weeks you hear something about, oh, China's flying a plane over Taiwan, there's military exercises, blah, blah, blah. I will say that invasion has been an issue for 60 years now. China actually did try to invade Taiwan several times back in the 50s and 60s. And as we know, Taiwan also wanted to invade China. So it's been a bit of a back and forth. Nonetheless, China's paramount leader, this guy over here, Xi Jinping, ordered the Chinese military to be ready for invasion by 2027. However, being ready does not mean it will actually happen, though. That's very important to keep in mind. Possible auspicious dates for invasion include 2027, 2035, and 2049, which are all kind of anniversaries of different important dates in Chinese history. So yeah, keep in mind that, a war isn't going to happen just because of a silly anniversary. There are actually practical reasons as to why it might happen. Probably the biggest one is that China is going for an economic downturn and demographic collapse. One thing to kind of keep in mind is that authoritarian dictatorships don't have a legitimate reason to be ruling their people. In democracy, you can point to the votes and say, well, the people want me in here. But a dictatorship can't say that, can they? So generally, a dictatorship legitimizes itself through kind of like economic or nationalist means. So economic means would be, I'm making you guys rich, so shut up and don't worry about the fact you can't choose your leader. Whereas a nationalist leader might be, for example, oh, we're going to make our country great again. So in situations where the economy is kind of going downhill, such as what's happening in China right now, countries will often choose the nationalist leader instead. You can look to Putin in Ukraine to give an example of that. So that's a possible reason as to why we might be coming up to a crunch moment, I suppose. It might also see itself as running out of time to retake Taiwan as its demographics crumble and Taiwan continues to arm itself. China does want peaceful reunification. That is 100% true. However, it will never, ever rule out the use of force. And this is something that Xi Jinping has said multiple times. And generally, with dictators, you should take them at their word. So that's all the background. Again, quite dense. But now we can start looking at different war scenarios. So this is the fun part. So by war scenarios, I mean there's kind of three ways in which China would likely try to take Taiwan. Whether it actually happens, or whether it's a combination of all three, or whether it's just one of them, no one knows for certain. But this is quite likely what one of these things will go down, or some combination thereof. So situation number one is a blockade. Pretty straightforward. China surrounds Taiwan from all sides, blocking trade and resources from entering. Spies and traders will try and sow chaos and deflate the Taiwanese will to exist. There's actually a lot of gangs in Taiwan, and they all have, a lot of them have links to the CCP, so go figure. Taiwan only has enough resources to last a few months. It may collapse and capitulate to Chinese demands within that period. It also makes it hard to fight back as no shots have been fired, quote unquote, so China has plausible deniability. The advantages are this doesn't result in a hot conflict. It has plausible deniability and it's more cost effective. The disadvantages are that it gives Taiwan's allies weeks or months to initiate countermeasures. It could lead to massive economic sanctions of China with no guarantee of success because no troops are landing on the island. It also makes, Chinese ships sitting ducks as they're literally sitting outside, the Taiwanese ports. And if Taiwan does want to go ballistic, then you're going to have a lot of sunk Chinese ships at the bottom of the ocean. So that's the blockade situation. Situation two is strategic strikes. Basically, ballistic missiles, EMP blasts, drones, and cyber attacks rain down on Taiwanese military and industry sites. Assassination of Taiwanese government officials happen up and down the island to weaken the kind of like ability to police or govern what's happening. Disinformation attacks convince the locals that resistance is futile, and a CCP-sponsored pro-peace movement demands Taiwan's capitulation. Okay, so the advantage is that this uses force and kind of flexes Chinese muscle without necessarily exposing its troops to danger. It can be actioned pretty much like that without significant buildup, making it much harder to determine when the attack's going to happen, giving you the element of surprise. It's also more cost-effective than a full invasion. The disadvantage is it doesn't necessarily prevent aid from reaching Taiwan. Let's say a Chinese ship came with like troops or food or something, and the Chinese bombed it with their ballistic missile. Well, congratulations, you now have a war with the US. So not a good idea. It could be seen as a half measure with crippling economic sanctions, but no guarantee of success. And failure to take out key military or political institutions will result in an aggressive Taiwanese attack. So imagine like, Taiwanese jets bombing Shanghai. It would be a disaster for China. So again, pros and cons to this strategy. The final one, and the most famous one, is a full invasion. So in this situation, extensive bombing campaigns cripple defenses, paratroopers attack key strategic sites, and amphibious assaults on beaches occur. One thing to note is that Taiwan, I believe, only has about 13 beaches which are actually suitable for an amphibious landing, and they're only available or good from a weather perspective for like 2 or 3 months in the year. So the element of surprise is really not a huge component of a full invasion, unfortunately for the Chinese. Supply lines to main troops and squash resistance must be created and maintained, and enormous damage and loss of life to both Chinese invaders and Chinese defenders would be absolutely expected, particularly if Taiwan starts firing missiles at the cities in China, which are also very close by. It could be disastrous for everyone involved. So the advantage is, of course, it takes full advantage of Chinese military capabilities. It could crush Taiwanese independence, possibly within a few days. Now, I'm not like a military expert. I'm very much an armchair general, but my opinion is that a war between Taiwan and China would probably be decided within 72 hours. If Taiwan can beat back the Chinese, then there'd be no more element of surprise. and quite likely the Allies would come to Taiwan's defense. Conversely, if China can take Taiwan within their 72 hours, there's not much anyone can do about it, but that's just my opinion. Proves to the world military superiority, and it could end the war before the Allies have a chance to lend help to Taiwan. The disadvantages are very large, though. It would justify an aggressive and potentially devastating Taiwanese counterattack. Amphibious assaults, which is by the water, are incredibly difficult, particularly for a country like China that hasn't fought a war in 50 years. Here's a fun fact. I believe there is exactly one officer in the entire Chinese army who actually has live military experience, and that's from the 70s when China attacked Vietnam. So you don't actually have a long history of people in the Chinese army actually knowing how to fight. I mean, they have training, but it's worth keeping in mind. They're not very used to it. If it fails, it will degrade Chinese military capabilities and end any chance of China becoming a great power, because if you can't even take back this little island off your coast, who's going to care about you after that point? And of course, it will almost certainly result in external military involvement plus crippling economic sanctions from Taiwan's allies, regardless of success or failure. And of course, the nuclear possibility of a war with the US, which would be very disastrous and probably change human history forever. So very, very dangerous approach if China were to take that. The conclusion to all this is that no one actually knows when a war between China and Taiwan will happen, if it happens at all. The Taiwanese have been living with the threat of invasion for 70 years, and few people there actually really are concerned or really notice it. I think most Taiwanese actually think it won't happen, but whether that's true or not, I guess we'll see. One other thing to consider is that the two countries are very closely economically linked. There's 200 billion USD worth of Taiwanese direct foreign investment in China, as well as about $167 billion of cross-strait trade annually, including all of China's advanced silicon chips. Well, I think the vast majority anyway, maybe they get some from Samsung and made in Taiwan. Is it worth the risk for a potential invasion that might not work? All we can do is wait and see. The only person who knows is Xi Jinping and, of course, all you armchair generals out there. All right, that is it. Thank you so much for watching the presentation. I know there was a lot there, but hopefully off the back of this, you should all be very well armed to kind of, wax lyrical about the situation every time you read a newspaper report about China flying a plane too close to China. All right. With that being said, does anyone have any questions or kind of discussion points they want to bring up off the back of that? I will field any questions you have now.